In the criminal law, a defense by excuse is a type of defense in which the defendant argues that they should not be held responsible for their actions because of some extenuating circumstances. This means that the defendant is not denying that they committed the crime, but they are saying that they should not be held criminally responsible for their actions because of some mitigating factor. The defense of insanity is one example of a defense by excuse. In the defense of insanity, the defendant argues that they should not be held responsible for their actions because they were unable to understand the nature of their actions or to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the alleged offense due to a mental illness or defect. There are other examples of defense by excuse, which include: first, the defense of self-defense is an excusable defense in which the defendant argues that they acted in self-defense in order to protect themselves from imminent harm. Second, the defense of necessity is an excusable defense in which the defendant argues that they committed the crime because it was necessary to prevent a greater harm from occurring. Third, the defense of duress is an excusable defense in which the defendant argues that they committed the crime because they were threatened or coerced into doing so by another person. Fourth, the defense of entrapment is an excusable defense in which the defendant argues that they were induced by law enforcement officials to commit the crime and that they would not have committed the crime without the inducement. Fifth, the defense of intoxication is an excusable defense in which the defendant argues that they were unable to form the necessary intent to commit the crime because they were under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Sixth, the defense of infancy is an excusable defense in which the defendant argues that they should not be held responsible for their actions because they were under the age of criminal responsibility at the time of the alleged offense. Seventh, the defense of automatism is an excusable defense in which the defendant argues that they were not in control of their actions at the time of the alleged offense due to some external factor such as a seizure or a blow to the head. In each of these defenses, the defendant is arguing that they should not be held responsible for their actions because of some extenuating circumstances that made it impossible for them to comply with the law. Like all other defense of excuse, the defense of insanity is based on the idea that a person who is suffering from a mental disorder or illness should not be held criminally responsible for their actions because they were unable to understand the nature and consequences of their actions at the time of the offense. This defense is typically raised in cases where the defendant is accused of committing a crime and their mental state is in question. The concept of the insanity defense has a long history dating back to ancient times when it was believed that people with mental illness were possessed by evil spirits. In modern times, the defense is based on the legal principle of mens rea, which means guilty mind. The principle of mens rea holds that a person can only be found guilty of a crime if they had the intention to commit the crime or if they were aware that their actions were wrong. The insanity defense is not a catch-all defense and is only used in a small number of cases. In order for the defense to be successful, the defendant must be able to show that they were suffering from a mental illness or disorder at the time of the offense, and that this illness or disorder prevented them from understanding the nature and consequences of their actions. The legal standard for determining whether a person is eligible to use the insanity defense varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but in general, a defendant must be able to demonstrate that they were unable to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the offense. This is known as the irresistible impulse test. In some jurisdictions, the defense may also be based on the Norton Rule, named after a 19th century British court case. This rule holds that a defendant is not responsible for their actions if, at the time of the offense, they were unable to understand the nature and quality of their actions, or if they were unable to control their actions due to a mental illness or disorder. The use of the insanity defense has been controversial, with some critics arguing that it is used too often to excuse criminal behavior, and others arguing that it is not used often enough to protect the rights of the mentally ill. Some states have abolished the defense altogether, while others have narrowed the criteria for its use. Despite these criticisms, the insanity defense remains a valid legal defense in many jurisdictions and has been used successfully in a number of high-profile cases. For example, in the case of John Hinckley Jr., who attempted to assassinate President Ronald Reagan in 1981, the defense of insanity was successfully used to have him committed to a psychiatric hospital instead of being sent to prison. In order for the insanity defense to be successful, the defendant must typically undergo a thorough mental health evaluation by a qualified expert. This evaluation will typically include a review of the defendant's medical records and a psychological examination. The expert will then provide a report to the court detailing the defendant's mental state at the time of the offense and whether they were able to understand the nature and consequences of their action. If the insanity defense is successful, the defendant will typically be committed to a psychiatric hospital or the other mental health facility for treatment, rather than being sent to prison. The length of time they will spend in treatment will depend on their progress and their continued need for care. One of the challenges of the insanity defense is that it can be difficult to prove. It is often up to the defendant's attorneys to provide evidence of their mental illness or disorder and to convince the court that the defendant was unable to understand the nature and consequences of their actions at the time of the offense. This can be a difficult task, and the outcome of an insanity defense case can be highly unpredictable. Overall, the defense of insanity is a complex and nuanced area of the criminal law. It requires careful consideration and evaluation of the defendant's mental state at the time of the alleged offense, and it is not always easy to prove. But for those who are truly unable to understand the nature of their actions or to distinguish right from wrong due to mental illness, the defense of insanity can provide an important safeguard against being held criminally responsible for their actions.